Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah. Being live streamed. All right.
We're going coast to coast, whatever coasts they may be.
Haven't been live in a long time.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Let's see. So Claudia just put up the URL for the YouTube. Well, we certainly have a nice audience. Why don't we begin? Is that okay?
Sure.
Welcome all to the 47th session of the Princeton-Bucharest seminar. And today the program is going to be Logic and Methodology in the Early Modern Period, a discussion on the occasion of the Perspectives on Science special issue. And we have 4 speakers today: Roger Ariev from University of South Florida, Elodie Cassan from ENS Lyon, Sorana Croianu from University of Bucharest, and Rudy Garau from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. And each of you, I take it, will speak, let me see, I have to do the arithmetic, roughly 15 minutes each, something like that, to leave time for discussion. Do you want the discussion immediately after each paper or all together at the end?
Maybe all together at the end.
Okay, then try to sort of limit yourself to 15 or 20 minutes. And
no more than 20 minutes. Fine. Okay.
So the first speaker is going to be Elodie Cassan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, thank Dana, thank Claudia for having us tonight. It's a joy to be here again and also an honor. And I would like to thank my co-panelists. I would like to thank Roger, Soana, and Rodolfo. I was very happy to work with you on this issue, and I'm also very happy to see you tonight. Now, let me share my screen. Okay, and is it okay? Can you see my screen? That's fine. Okay, so this panel session is intended as a contribution to the reconstruction of the history and importance of logic in the building of early modern philosophy. It will consist in the presentation of some of the major hypotheses articulated on this topic in Logic and Methodology in the Early Modern Period. This is a volume which was published as a special issue of Perspectives on Science. Volume 29, third issue, May, June 2021. The delivery of the papers will follow the chronological order according to which the essays composing the volume are already arranged. So the purpose of my paper will be to determine the scope of the problem we studied in the volume, and with a focus on Bacon. Then Roger Ariev, University of South Florida, will go on with a paper on Descartes. Sorana Croianu from University of Bucharest will go on the third with a paper on Gassendi, and Rodolfo Garau from Ca' Foscari University of Venice will go on the fourth, and then the floor will be open for discussion. So the project is the following. We are going towards a philosophical history of early modern logic. What does this mean? maybe we can begin with the idea that it is well known that authors from Montaigne to Kant, belonging to different traditions, shared an interest in harshly criticizing scholastic logic as verbose and sterile. Now, what truly makes the philosophical import of these critical assessments is much less known. Such is our concern in the volume. Despite such widespread rhetoric of the rejection and rupture with the logical tradition, early modern philosophers do devote attention to logic in the construction of their systems of knowledge. Why is that so? What kind of change and continuity in the understanding of the role of logic does this stand reflect? What does this gesture tell us about the building of the philosophical discourse in the early modern period? Such were our questions. In order to present the general orientation of our work, I shall proceed the following way. First of all, I will present a seemingly compelling objection to the project dealt with in the issue. Then I shall describe the issue addressed in the volume, and I will end with a case study, which is Bacon's Novum Organum. First of all, there is a seemingly compelling objection. Isn't there a mise en sommeil de la logique in the 17th century? Mise en sommeil de la logique is an expression which is a quote taken, which I take from a classic book written by the French historian of logic, Robert Blanchet, and I take it as an exemplary illustration of a long-lasting claim about the status of logic in the early modern period. What is the meaning of this claim? What are the limits of this claim? Well, according to this claim, in the early modern period, logic did not attract the attention of the best minds, with the exception of Leibniz. That is to say that in current histories of logic, emphasis is put on one side on Aristotle's organon and on the Stoics' logic of propositions, and on the other side, on the development of mathematical logic from Boole and Frege on. In the picture often emerging from such reconstruction represents early modern philosophers, save their criticisms of Aristotelian syllogism, as largely estranged from this discipline. What are the limits of this claim? Current research in the history of logic in the early modern period showed and continues to show the falsity of this depiction. The 17th century voicing of criticism concerning the historical state of logic is no longer seen as an absurd attempt at invalidating this discipline as such. The methodological choice to take logic as an actor category permitted to bring to the fore the scope of the notion of logic in the 17th century. It is now established that in this period, logic's purpose is to teach how to accurately arrange and order mental material in order to reason without error. To put it in a nutshell, early modern logic involves both theories of ideas and of the operations of the intellect, and descriptions of the knowledge acquisition process. In other words, in the early modern period, presentations of the steps for the building of a reasoning, of forms of reasoning and of their uses are commonly closely intertwined with remarks about the acquisition of ideas and about the grooming of the cognitive faculties. So the 17th century treatment of logic in non-exclusively formal terms is not tantamount to a rejection of this essential component of logic. It just showed that at that time, philosophers do not conceive logic as a self-contained formal discipline, but rather as an area of knowledge which straddles a variety of different fields. Differently said, a presentation of the early modern philosophical understanding of the purpose of logic in terms of a blacklisting of Aristotle and of syllogistic logic is reductive. And this reduction, this simplification, is detrimental from a hermeneutical point of view because it hinders understanding of the early modern philosophers' familiarity with logic and of their conception of this discipline as philosophically foundational and prominent. As a consequence, in the essays composing the volume, a different line of approach is proposed. The issue addressed in the volume is what specific philosophical function do early moderns attribute to what they call logic? What does this question mean, first of all? The articles published in the issue bring to the fore that in a period once thought to have made little contribution to logic, this discipline actually contributed to the building of philosophical modernity. They emphasize that 17th century Greek designs of philosophical reformation are to some extent grounded on logic and on a reevaluation of its specific purpose and of its specific part in the building of philosophy. In other words, the question no longer is, shouldn't early modern philosophers label psychology of knowledge what they call logic? The question is reshaped and replaced with the question, what specific philosophical function do early moderns attribute to what they call logic? Second point, what is the philosophical import of this question? The consideration of that question aims at contributing to an exploration of the ways the territory of philosophy is constructed in the 17th century. To be sure, logic traditionally plays an essential part in the building of philosophy. This traditional function may be traced back to antiquity. Stated bluntly, in this period, we have logic viewed either as a propedeutic to philosophy or as an intrinsic part of it. The first perspective is Aristotelian, and the second is endorsed by the Hellenistic philosophers, and it is also articulated in great details by the Stoics. And the thing is that, however different these frameworks may be, they show a common concern with the determination of the formal and cognitive conditions one must fulfill in order to make true reasoning. Besides, this logical mechanism serves a similar objective, the legitimation of the building of a philosophical discourse. Basically, the idea is that a philosophical use of discourse is justified by the search after truth. In this context, the notion of truth is not boiled down to validity. It is apprehended both in formal and in material terms. So the ancients, to some extent, follow Plato's archetypal characterization of philosophy as opposed to sophistry. This characterization being based on a distinction between opinion and truth. And accordingly, the ancients defined philosophy as framed by certain standards of rationality, and logic as the discipline which theorizes and exposes these standards. So the question is, where do moderns stand with respect to this approach to logic as providing the tools for the building of philosophical discourse? This is my third point. What is the answer to this question provided by the volume? On the one hand, while the moderns see themselves as the artisan of a major philosophical renewal, like the ancient, they apprehend philosophy in terms of a system of knowledge, and they regard logic as providing a necessary foundation for philosophical investigation. So the idea that a claim to novelty does not preclude a constant cross of the theoretical divide between old and new. And on the other hand, while the modern, their search for a new logic frequently takes the shape of a discussion of the traditional conceptual apparatus of this discipline, it is a source of major philosophical innovations. Basically, it is instrumental in the 17th century renewal of natural philosophy. Bacon's Novum Organum is very much representative of this, as I would like to show in the last part of this presentation. Let me begin this way. As a recap of my paper on Bacon in the volume, there are two claims I would like to put forward. First, I would like to suggest that it is possible to read the Novum Organum as a contribution to philosophical modernity, which is not a book of philosophy. And second, I would like to suggest that it is possible to read the Novum Organum as an exemplary illustration of the early modern grounding of a renewal of natural philosophy on a discussion of the traditional conceptual apparatus of logic. First point, what does that mean? The Novum Organum, a contribution to philosophical modernity, which is not a book of philosophy. Well, it means that this book illustrates in an exemplary manner the composition along the lines of the traditional subdivision of philosophy of some of the major books commonly recognized as founding philosophical modernity. Because to be sure, the Novum Organum has metonymically been interpreted as basically promoting philosophical modernity, but it is not intended by its author as a book of philosophy. It is intended as a book of logic. And the idea that Bacon's attributing the Novum Organum a pivotal role in the framing of his philosophical project, the Great Instauration of the Sciences, obeys to ancient heuristic standards originating in Aristotle's philosophy, and according to which logic serves as a propedeutic to philosophy. First claim, the title itself explicitly refers to logic as a discipline taught as a preparation for philosophy in the academic field, and there is an obvious game with Aristotle, an intertextuality. It's the Novum Organum expresses the intention to depart from Aristotle's organum and to contribute to a renewal of logic as a discipline beyond the university. Second point, the status Bacon attributes to this discipline is made pretty clear in, for instance, a letter to King James I, which I quote in my handout. Quote, I read the passage, "The work, in what colors soever it may be set forth, is no more but a new logic teaching to invent and judge by induction, as finding syllogism incompetent for sciences of nature, and thereby to make philosophy and sciences both more true and more active." So here Bacon is very clear. We have a new logic, and the entrenchment of this book in the field of logic serves his philosophical agenda. We can account for this claim the following way. It is established that Bacon intends to replace syllogism, the deductive form of reasoning, which is the center of the organon, with induction, the process of propositional inference that is designed by Aristotle to bring out the premises of the syllogism. It is already known that Bacon grounds his philosophical project, which entails a new understanding of nature, on a switch from a conception of logic based on the syllogism to an approach to logic based on induction. And he justified this shift by an understanding of syllogism as a form of reasoning, providing a method for disputation, not for science, and by a reinvention of induction, whose reshaping makes it an instrument of scientific discovery. But it is it should be added that in so doing, he also endorses the view that the making of a sound philosophical discourse is grounded on the articulation of a theory of reasoning. It is an Aristotelian approach to the building of philosophy, where logic is not a part of philosophy, but a preparative for it. Needless to say, Bacon's statement about the disciplinary status of the novum organum does not make sense if it is a declaration of intent alien to this concrete achievement, but it presents, as I show in the paper, it also is instrumental in deciphering the complex structure of the book it provides a comment about. The main question still remains. The question is, what is at stake from a philosophical point of view in this indication of the way Bacon wants Novum Organum to be read? At the very end of his volume, Bacon asks his reader to take heed that he has gone through a book which deals with logic, not with philosophy. What does that mean? Well, this is the second point I would like to address here as a way of recapping the twofold hypothesis of this topic I put forward in my paper. First point, throughout the Novum Organum, Bacon reassesses the semantic relation between things, concepts, and words, a semantic issue which has been a major concern from Aristotle's Organon on. He does so because he takes it that a sound natural philosophy can be envisioned only on the grounds of a methodical inquiry into the formal conditions of the meaning, reference, and truth of proposition. This reassessment is at the core of his building of the definition of logic he builds throughout the book. He defines logic as the adorning and decking out of the marriage bed of the mind and the universe. This Baroque expression is an intentional and technical formulation of the purpose of logic. It involves an ontological, a psychological, a formal component. This Bacon's specific way of joining these parameters is the result of a systematic discussion of Aristotle's claim that the relation between reality, thinking, and language is that of the existence of a natural relationship between the order of things and the order of thought, so that concepts signified by words signify things. In Bacon's view, Aristotle's of meaning and reference at stake here is very is misleading and deceptive. This claim is at the core of his exposition of the theory of ideals. And my point is that this research Bacon undertakes in the field of logic, this work has a major philosophical import. Bacon's redesign of the structure of things, concepts, and words govern the interpretation of experiment in terms of a kind of reasoning he also articulates in the Novum Organum. He affirmed that there is an irreducible gap between what reality consists in and what the mind perceives of it when researching the experimental procedure permitting a methodical and systematic exploration of natural phenomena. So as a conclusion, I would say that the efforts he makes so as to facilitate access to experience are the logical outcome of his depart from Aristotle's understanding of the relationship between things, words, and ideas, which in Bacon's view allow for the building of purely verbal reasoning rather than assisting the mind in its effort to know the world. And this illustrates that the transformation undertaken by early modern philosophers in the field of logic account to some extent for major innovation that occur in the field of natural philosophy during that period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Elodie. The next Presentation will be by Roger Ariev.
You're muted.
There we go. No, you're muted.
Unmute. Okay, I am muted. I'm no longer muted, and I'm and my screen's visible. That's good. That's wonderful. Thanks. Anyway, let me start by paraphrasing what Elodie said. For early moderns, logic involves the acquisition of ideas and the grooming of cognitive faculties. I argue this thesis with respect to Descartes and the Cartesians. They think that logic is an ars cogitandi, an art of thinking well, whose aim is to perfect the ingenium, or wit, by the exercise of its operations, ideating, judging, discoursing, and ordering or method. We can see these elements as the underpinning of the reguli and the discourse, as well as the meditations. Thus, like Bayet, Gassendi, and others in the 17th century, we can understand these works as embodying Descartes' logic, despite Descartes' notorious anti-logic rhetoric in his writings. Both Bayet and Gassendi wrote sections of their main works explaining what they considered Descartes' logic to be. As Bayet indicated, several savants thought that Descartes' method in a discourse, that is, the rules he prescribes for the conduct of the mind, constituted Descartes' logic. Others believed Descartes' logic was, true logic was displayed in the meditation because there, after stripping away all beliefs acquired by education, custom, and authority, he established thinking as the principle under which he wanted to base his whole philosophy. Bayet refers to Gassendi for this latter view, citing his chapter, The Logic of Descartes, from the Syntagma. Gassendi there says that the meditations contain Descartes' logic because of the principle Descartes posits in the work, namely, everything I clearly and distinctly perceive is true. For Gassendi, given that the mind can err when thinking, to keep itself from doing so, it provides for itself the art of logic, whereby it can direct its own operations and attain truth by making them immune from error. According to Gassendi, Descartes, quote, believed that there were enough resources in the intellect that it could have perfect knowledge of all things, and even the most abstruse ones, that is, not only of bodies, but of God and the soul by its own power, unquote. Gassendi indicates that Descartes' logic is an ars cogitandi, or an art of thinking well. On the other hand, Bayet focuses on the method of the discourse as Descartes' sample of logic, asserting as well that what Descartes was content to sketch has since been brought to fruition by Claubert and the Port-Royal logic. So we can also add its later developments in the textbooks of Legrand and Régis. Clearly, neither Gassendi nor Bayet would have thought that Descartes' logic is a dissonant or self-contradictory notion. What gives legitimacy to Bayet's view is a passage from the preface to the 1647 edition of the Principles, the Lettre Préface. There, Descartes refers to the discourse as, quote, a discourse on the method for conducting one's reason well and for seeking the truth in the sciences, where I summarized the principal rules of logic. Thus, at least by 1647, Descartes came to call his method and the four rules given in the discourse as the principal rules of logic. This can be explained by a passage from the same preface about the tree of philosophy and the order of teaching. According to Descartes, before applying himself to true philosophy, a person who has, quote, common and imperfect knowledge should study logic. Quote, the logic that teaches us how to best direct our reason to discover those truths of which we are ignorant. Not the logic of the schools, which, quote, properly speaking, is only a dialectic that teaches how to make things we know understood by others, or even to repeat without forming any judgment on them many words respecting those we do not know, unquote. Descartes adds that since what he endorses is very dependent on custom, it is good for people to practice its rules for a long time on easy and simple questions. So according to the later Descartes, at least, the logic of the schools is a dialectic that corrupts rather than perfects the mind. But now the word dialectic seems to refer only to a part of logic. Traditionally, it's the part after formal syllogism and demonstration, dealing with topics or probable syllogism and sophistical reputations. Only a part of logic and not to logic as a whole. He recommends his method as another logic, that is, as a good practical exercise to improve one's mental faculties. There's another passage predating these in which Descartes calls something his logic. In the first set of replies, speaking of the idea of God, Descartes says, quote, according to the rules of the true logic, one should never ask whether something exists unless one first understands what it is. Presumably, Descartes originally said, according to the rules of my logic. Since referring to this passage, Descartes asked Mersenne in the 1640 letter, quote, to put instead, according to the rules of the true logic, in the place where I put according to the rules of my logic. It is difficult to make much sense of these passages, but such details should not detain us, at least not now. At least they show, at the very least, that Descartes was referring to something as his logic, at least as early as 1640. This also allows us to speculate that the seeming change that is Descartes' later more positive view about logic may only be a change of rhetoric or emphasis, and at bottom he had something like the later view from the start. It leaves us with the fact that despite his criticisms of logic, there is something he calls his logic. So what is it? As the scholastic ask in their preliminary question, is this logic a science or an art? What is its object or subject? What are its parts? Let me sketch some late scholastic answers to such questions. Of course, these form the context for Descartes' logic. Scholastic textbooks usually start a discussion with the status of logic, whether it is a science like the branches of philosophy, physics, and metaphysics. The disciplines are divided into those dealing with contingent things such as the arts and those dealing with necessary things such as the sciences. They are also divided into the theoretical, namely metaphysics, physics, and mathematics, and the practical, such as ethics and politics. The theoretical disciplines are properly called science because they teach the knowledge of things through their own causes. Logic fits badly within these classifications. It doesn't look like a science or an art. It's neither theoretical nor practical. It doesn't seem productive like an art. And it does not treat necessary things or make things known through their causes. There are, however, different ways of thinking about the arts as productive. While logic does not actually produce anything sensible or enduring, it can be called an art because it directs an action. With logic, this would be the production of an intellectual action, as in reasoning. The question of whether logic is a science also depends upon the resolution about the object of logic. The Thomist opinion is that the object of logic is the being of reason, which directs the three operations of the mind. According to this view, logic is not about real beings or even intentions such as man, mortality, etc., but second intentions such as predicate, genus, species, etc., which reason derives from the object it considers. These aren't found in reality, but are a result of the consideration of reason. While most Thomists think of logic as a science concerned with beings of reason, others argue that beings of reasons are imaginary, that in effect non-beings. This causes them to reject logic as a science, properly speaking, because its demonstration will be about fictive objects, not about things through their causes. But still others reply that logic is a science given the certainty of its demonstration, which they assert are infallible and as certain as the science required by the knowledge of things through their own causes. This is similar to the conclusion used to affirm mathematics as a science, given that mathematics is also not about real beings, but deals with abstractions. Those who reject being of reason as the object of logic usually consider with the Scotists logic to be an art of mental discourse whose aim is the perfection of the operations of the mind. This creates a certain convergence in early modern logic. Whether one is a Thomist or a Scotist, late scholastics tend to agree that the parts of logic are the operations of the understanding. This is how Eustachius Paulus structures his logic. As he says, so it's three operations of the understanding. That's what we're seeing in his general schema that you can see in one view, and you go three operations, and then what is being discussed in the three operations. So as Eustachius says, the first operation concerns, quote, things presented to the mind by a kind of simple vision without affirmation or denial, that is, simple apprehension. Simple apprehension or cognition of the mind is divided into two kinds. The first confused and the second distinct. Quote, the first involves the intellection of what a word signifies. The second involves not merely what the word signifies, but also a clear and distinct conception of the thing that the word signifies. The first may be said to be the apprehension of a word or term, the second of a nature or essence, unquote. Simple apprehension is to be contrasted with the second operation concerned with truth and falsity, in which the mind, quote, compares or assents or dissents to things. And the third operation, where from many things thus collected together, the mind infers something distinct from them by a process of reasoning or argument. The third operation is then called discourse and argument. That's Eustachius. This is Gautier and Maurice, one of Susanna Berger's plural images. You have the Garden of Logic, the three gardens of logic, in which Maurice leads his students through a gate on which it's written dialectica definitur ars discerendi. Dialectics is to be defined as an art of discussion, discourse. So the view that logic, I think that I couldn't avoid this picture. The view that logic, and by the way, Scotus is in the upper left-hand corner. The view that logic is an art whose end is the perfection of the operation of the understanding is not a fully settled doctrine for the late scholastics, but becomes more so as the century progresses. Moreover, it gets subsumed into the logic of the Cartesians, but with an important difference that method, considered as a fourth operation of the understanding, is given special emphasis. The Port Royal logic of Arnaud and Nicole, the logique of Régis, the logic of Legrand, are all divided into four parts constituted by the four principal operations of the mind. Régis calls his logic la logique ou l'art de penser, in parallel with the Port Royal title. Legrand asserts logic is nothing else but the art of right thinking, of using our reason aright, where by the word thinking, we not only understand simple ideas or notions, but also judgments and discourses. Now that a man may use right reason and be able to frame his thoughts aright and interpret them to other, it is necessary for him to perceive aright, judge aright, reason aright, and order aright, quoting Legrand. So are these Cartesians following Descartes in this, or are they imposing a late scholastic framework onto Descartes' thought? To answer this question, we have to construct Descartes' views from the very little he says about such things in his works. Our evidence would be the reguli and the discourse, though we should pay attention to the De Methodo, the Latin version of the discourse, because that vocabulary is somewhat richer, allowing Descartes to make clearer some discussions that are not fully evident in the French. Take, for example, the very well-known opening paragraphs of the discourse, where Descartes is trying to put forth a doctrine about whether and how to one can improve one's mind. The first sentence of the discourse, the very well-known first sentence of the discourse, states that good sense is the best distributed thing in the world. Although the complete sentence seems like a self-referential joke, Descartes is serious about the main claim. He immediately asserts, it's not likely that everyone is mistaken in this. Here, good sense translates to bon sens. Sorry, that's not what I meant. Here, good sense translates to bon sens in the 1637 Discourse, and bon amends in the 1644 De Methodo. And that's what I have. I have the one parallel texts of bon amends and bon sens. Bon amends in red, bon sens in blue. Moreover, the Latin text reinforces that it is a better mind, a meliorum mentum, that people do not usually desire more of. Descartes then supports his view by asserting, quote, the power of judging well and of discerning the true from the false, which properly speaking, what people call good sense or reason, is naturally equal in all men, and that the diversity of our opinions does not rise from the fact that some people are more reasonable than others. The view is clear. Good sense, bon amends, bon sens, reason, la raison, recta ratione, the power of judging well and distinguishing the true from the false do not admit of degree. They're equal in all humans. These are immediately contrasted with another series of mental faculties that do in fact admit of degrees. Descartes asserts, quote, it's not enough to have a good mind. Here mind is esprit in French, but ingenium in Latin. We're down right in here. I don't know if you can see that, but it was still the first paragraph towards the bottom third. And he follows up with examples of unequal mental powers. Quote, for myself, I never presumed that my mind was in any respect more perfect than that of ordinary men. In fact, I've often desired to have as quick a wit, or as keen and distinct an imagination, or as full and responsive a memory as some other people. Unquote. So what admits of a degree is not having a good mind, one more perfect than others, but here again, the word for mind is esprit in French and ingenium in Latin, and not bon amends. The examples concern wit or quick thinking, pensée, cogitatio, imagination and memory. Descartes reiterates his thesis, making it palatable to scholastics, and introduces his goal of trying to perfect the mind. Quote, other than these, I know of no qualities that serve in the perfecting of the mind, esprit, ingenium. As to reason or sense, inasmuch as it alone makes us men and distinguishes us from the beasts, I prefer to believe that it exists whole and entire in each of us, and in this to follow the opinion commonly held by philosophers who say that there are differences of degree only between accidents and not at all between the forms or natures of the individuals of the same species. Descartes ends by asserting that his method will allow one to increase that perfection. Quote, I formed a method by which it seems to me I have the means to increase my knowledge by degrees and raise it little by little to the highest point which the mediocrity of my mind and a short duration of my life will allow it to attain. Here again, reason, la raison, ratio, which is the same as bon sens, bon amends, is equal in all people, akin to their nature, and mind, esprit, ingenium, together with wit, imagination, and memory, is unequal in people, akin to accidents of their nature, that is, capable of degrees and being perfected by method. All these elements can be found in Legrand's Compendium of Cartesian Philosophy. In the chapter of the institutions of philosophy, Legrand examines the various operations of the mind. He distinguishes intellect, will, and imagination, then discusses wit, what wit is, the diversity of wit, the qualities of wit, the celerity of thinking, and ending up with a comparison between wit and reason. According to Legrand, there's a great diversity of wit, but it cannot be imputed to the diversity of souls. Quoting Legrand, For souls are intellectual and incorporeal, and they seem, according to nature, to be altogether equal. The variety of wit proceeds from, quote, the variety of our organs, especially of the brain. We must not understand not human reason, pure and abstracted from the body, but the same so far as it is perfected or hindered in any manner by the disposition of the body. Legrand then refers to Descartes' discourse and mentions that Descartes knows of no quality of wit other than celerity of thinking, facility of distinctly imagining, and capacity and use of memory, by which wit can be rendered more excellent. According to Legrand, Descartes distinguishes wit from right reason or a good mind, that is, a power of judging incorruptly and discerning the true from false, which he concludes to be equal in all. The chapter ends with advice on improving one's celerity of thinking, facilities of imagining, and capacity of memory. Since they all depend upon the disposition of the body, the inequality of these operations proceeding from the inequality of one's organs, the capacity of are improved by the use and rendered familiar by habit and custom. Legrand's Institutions of Philosophy began in 1671 as a language textbook, Latin language textbook, and expanded throughout the 1680s. The fourth edition of the textbook corresponds to the 1694 compendium in English translation. There, every instance of wit was originally an instance of ingenium. An ingenium is contrasted with right reason or a good mind. So far, we've argued that ingenium, or wit, can be improved by method through constant use. This result is situated in the discourse, which, like the reguli before it, notoriously contrasts the positive effect of method, that is, logic, with what it calls the negative effect of logic, that is, dialectics. Still, we haven't shown that Descartes considers his logic to be an art, not a science. However, in the same preface to the principle that we've referred to before, where Descartes calls his method a logic and gives a positive slant to his logic, that logic teaches us how to best direct our reason in order to discover those truths of which we are ignorant. He describes the tree of philosophy, including all the sciences, but doesn't mention logic, which he places outside the tree as preliminary to applying oneself to true philosophy and by inference to the sciences. So let us conclude that Descartes and the Cartesians are probably in agreement that logic is an ars whose aim is to perfect the ingenium through the exercise of its operations, ideating, judging, discoursing, and ordering. We can see that these elements are basic to the discourse and the reguli, as well as meditation, though I haven't argued for this here. And thus, like Baillet and Legrand, we can understand the discourse as embodying Descartes' logic. Finis.
Thank you very much, Roger. And the next speaker is going to be Sorana Corneanu.
Thank you, Dan. I'll start sharing my screen too. And while I do so, I have to say, Gassendi is new territory for me. And I will thank here Rudy once again, as I do in the paper, for sharing the manuscript of the English translation of Gassendi's logic that he's preparing together with Justin Smith for Oxford University Press. That was a lot of help. So thank you, Rudy. At the same time, I enjoyed working for this paper enormously. I don't know if I'm right, but I hope I am in what I'm going to say. Let me get to it then. I started from a question. All right, here we go. And the question was, what was the imagination doing in Gassendi's logic? So I became interested in this topic. What is imagination there? Why is it assigned a logical role? So I thought I'd inquire into why this is so, where does this come from, and with what consequences? As I went along, it seemed to me that the imagination might constitute a clue to what Gassendi is doing in the logic. And I'll tell you in a minute what I think the imagination does there. And I also think that now that Gassendi's logic merits an important place in the early modern history of logic, even though perhaps in a different manner than that proposed by those who included in a history of what they call the logic of ideas. That's probably not exactly the best description of this kind of logic. So in a nutshell, the argument is the following. The logical role of the imagination, Gassendi, answers to his empiricist epistemology and his naturalized view of the mind, which crucially involves the defense of thinking in animals. Second, it is operative in his pairing the formal mechanism of logical operations with what I call a progressive mechanism of the operations of the mind, and I will explain. And thirdly, the latter, the progressive mechanism, serves, it seems to me, in the logic as a counterpart to his experimental understanding of the progress of knowledge. So first, before asking what is the imagination doing in a logic, of course, the first question is, what is mind doing in a logic? And I'll start by referring to the three acts that Roger has already invoked with reference to Eustachius. Gassendi follows the scheme, this organizational scheme. But this has a long history. It's there in the late scholastics. One of the identifiable sources for the scholastics themselves is in Thomas Aquinas, in his commentaries on Aristotle's own interpretation and the posterior analytics, with, importantly, reference to Aristotle's De Anima. But also there is a variation on this topic in a more unexpected place, perhaps, in Aquinas, which I'd like to bring out. And this is the sections on man in the Summa, where Aquinas asks whether reason and intellect are distinct powers of the human soul, and answers in the negative, since although their actions are slightly different, what they achieve is ultimately the same thing. How is that? To understand the proper action of the intellect is to apprehend intelligible truth, and to reason, the proper action of reason is to advance from one thing that has been understood to another, not yet understood, and thus to reach knowledge of intelligible truth. We can see this better if we compare humans to angels. While angels apprehend every intelligible truth perfectly and instantly, the human condition is such that we need to advance from one thing to another through mental discourse, in other words, through a mental process that progresses through inquiry and discovery. Reasoning is to understanding as movement is to rest. Now, this passage, although it does not constitute the main recognized legacy of Aquinas in late scholastic logics, this passage is reprised without acknowledgement by the Coimbran commentators in their defense of the view of logic as an art of reasoning. Now, the idea of the movement of reasoning, which I take to as the motto of my paper, the movement of reasoning, lies behind the development in late scholasticism towards the highlighting of the three acts of the mind as governing logic. The reference is to what the intellect does in working through the formal logical operations, to the progress it makes towards truth, as well as to the obstacles it might encounter on the way. From the start, mind is part of logic because the treatment of reasoning is seen to lie between logic and the study of the soul, or even of man. Gassendi too works with the three acts, which I've summarized here, even before Port-Royal, which made them, the Port-Royal logic, which made them much more famous. And for him too, logic is both about structures of formal validity and about what the mind does in knowing things, with an increased focus on the latter, yet without discarding the former, the formal validity issues. In fact, the argument in this paper is that Gassendi reinterprets the formal structures in such a way as to pair them closely with the operations of the mind, and that the imagination was critical in this reinterpretation. And in this way, he bequeathed to the moderns a reinterpreted ancient legacy. Let me come back to my motto: reasoning is to understanding as movement is to rest. Now, compared to Aquinas, Gassendi modifies the object of understanding, which he grounds in the realm of the sensible, obviously, and exchanges the angels for the wise man, but preserves the general thinking about the operations of the mind. Here's a quote: "And in the man who is particularly wise, knowledge is almost free of discursive reasoning and is nearly simple intelligence. For in examining an idea, he discerns with one look the antecedents and the consequence, while in the ignorant man, this happens not without a certain amount of tiring discursive reasoning and time, for he needs to pause and speculate so that once he has comprehended the antecedents, he sees what follows from them." Now, the idea that he is talking about here in examining an idea, the idea in the mind of the wise man, is actually the well-formed, perfect idea in his vocabulary. And I will return to this at the end of my talk. So it seems to me that Gassendi revisits this topos in Aquinas: reasoning is to understand because movement is to rest. And much follows from this, as I hope to show you. Right, so here, I've given an explanation why mind is there. The mind is there in a logic. Now let's see why the imagination is there in Gassendi's logic. In short, the answer that I give in the paper is the following. There is a cluster of interrelated reasons, it seems to me. The first is that the prime object, as I said briefly earlier, the prime objects of the mind's logical processes are much closely tied to sense perception than they ever were for the scholastic tradition. The images or ideas that Gassendi talks about are different from both the scholastic intellectual species and from the Cartesian ideas. And Gassendi obviously also uses this Epicurean conception of sense as a criterion of knowledge. So everything is closer to the senses in knowledge formation. And that's pretty much what has been called the epistemological load of the component of Gassendi's logic, as of other early modern logics. Whether it is right to call it epistemological or not is a topic for debate. A second reason is that Gassendi has a conception of reasoning that includes the mind's capacity to see. He uses the word to see rather in the sense of to grasp or to attend to the logical processes going on in the mind. Third reason, and this is the one I will insist on today, the logical processes are analyzed in terms of linear concatenations of mutually coherent apprehensions. I'll return in a minute. And a fourth reason is that the imagination is key to Gassendi's defense of solertia brutorum, the thesis that animals can think. So what I wanted to do is to compare the sections on logic, the three acts of the mind in both Gassendi's Logica and in his Physica. They're complementary to each other, and see the contours of the logical imagination in this way. So the idea I highlighted earlier, linear concatenations of mutually coherent apprehensions. Gassendi highlights the mind's various acts of composition as key to the process of reasoning. Starting from simple apprehension of composite terms or ideas, you have several examples there, up to judgment and syllogism, seen as acts in which the mind sees or discerns the coherence, he also calls this congruity or conjunction between two apprehensions, either directly as in judgment or via middle term as in a syllogism. For example, in the case of judgment, in the case of judgment, this amounts to highlighting the mind's act of composition, joining ideas that are mutually agreeable and grasping the conjunction as such as a thing in itself, alongside the predication and the mind's assent. So with the focus on composition, a dog's judgment, man, master, two images that are correlated in his mind, involves the same mechanism, really, a compositive act of the imagination as a human's judgment. This man is my master. I'll return to the syllogism a bit later. So in summary, in his treatment of the three logical acts of the mind, distributed as it is between the logic and the physics, Gassendi reduced to a minimum the distinction between the imagination and the intellect, that is pertinent to logic, was concerned with defending the existence of reasoning in animals, and used the three acts as attributed to the imagination to build his defense. And also he identified the act of composition, whether in the guise of the composite terms of simple apprehension, the concatenations of judgment, or those of syllogism, as the core mechanism of the three acts. Next, I wanted to know how novel was all of this. And the major finding, if I may say so, of this research has been that, in fact, the scheme of the three acts is already transferred to the imagination within scholastic discussions, not of logic, but rather of the natural philosophical discussions of the soul. And the imagination is transferred to the internal senses in these discussions, with reference to the topic of particular reason, that is the cognition and reasoning about singulars and particulars which humans share with brutes. Now, Gassendi uses this, but also shifts the weight of the comparison here. While the scholastics warned that the judging and discoursing imagination they talk about is specific to humans, since it works in conjunction with the intellect, Gassendi turned the reasoning function of the imagination to a square defense of thinking in animals. However, there were dissenting voices among the scholastics as well, and that came very close to Gassendi's views. And I give here an example from Johannes Velcurius, the Anima commentary, where he has an example that is really identical with Gassendi's example. It may have been standard in scholastic literature, but anyway, so he says, in one of the places talking of fantasia, the imagination, there is simple fantasia, which is also in brutes, as when a dog thinks, this is my master, and composite fantasia, which he thinks is also in brutes as well. I also give a reference to very interesting passage in Velcurio talking of complex intelligible species, where it emerges that for Velcurio, the other phase of predication is really a composite mental image. In the phrase that I used, a linear concatenation of images in the mind. So it goes, just as a proposition is made of a predicate and a subject, or from multiple terms. So this species, the complex intelligible species, is composed from many images of many things, which the proposition includes. For instance, when I understand propositions of this kind, that the heavens are perpetually moved, or the other one. In this proposition, I conceive the subject and predicate at the same time, as if I saw a picture composed of many images, such as in a picture of a battle. Because I conceive heaven, perpetual motion, linear concatenation. So the scholastics make room for the imagination as a logical faculty in their discussions of the soul, but Gassendi moves all of this into his logic, which the scholastics did not. Now, so where does this go? I propose that Gassendy's approach to logic was shaped by his revisitation of the Thomistic idea that attention to the three acts is ultimately attention to the movement of reasoning that aspires to understanding. One consequence of this revisitation, it seems to me, is that Gassendy's linear concatenations are ultimately progressive concatenations. And by progress here, I understand the etymological sense of a temporal, gradual, list structured sequence. Now, the key to this is Gassendy's use of the Porphyrian tree of genus and species. He introduces a variant of it in the part on simple apprehension and calls it the series of ideas or things. He uses it again in the parts on syllogism and on method in order to show how to solve problems such as, is man a living being or is man a substance? Standard problems. Now, the formal mechanism of a syllogism is one in which obviously the proof depends on the valid way in which the middle term connects the subject and the attribute. The progressive mechanism of the syllogism, the one that Gassendy superimposes on the formal mechanism, is one in which the mind goes up and down the series of things and follows the agreement of the ideas step by step, and does so by comparing ideas two by two. For example, the proof of the proposition man is a living being consists in the formal mechanism that is clear to everyone. The progressive mechanism is the following, as Gassendy describes it. The mind inspects man and going up the series of things, compares it with animal, and then going up again, compares the latter with living being, and finds that they agree. So the mind's progress along the series of things could be figured thus: man, animal, living being. In the paper, I also comment on how this is possibly echoed in Locke's treatment of the syllogism and the process of reasoning in the essay. But I won't have time to go into that now. Instead, I'll offer a piece of speculation, which is that Gassendy may have intended this illustration to go beyond the usual scholastic pedagogical purpose of the Porphyrian tree, and for his purposes serve as a device for the imagination. Thus, in reasoning based on genus and species, the mind's eye will be able to literally, that is visually, move along a figured sequence. The force of inference, therefore, is translated into the force of a visualized temporal concatenation. And the drawing figures precisely the linear concatenation and suggests the temporal progression of the mind. Well, that was a piece of speculation. But anyway, it seems to me that this is Gassendy's version of the Thomistic movement of reasoning, now seen as a markedly temporal, gradualist, linear progress of the mind's operation. And if this is so, it is also connected to a distinctly modern understanding of the progress of knowledge through experience. For Gassendy, logic cannot be impervious to the notion that knowledge progresses through time. An idea that should not be understood in the Enlightenment sense of a triumphalist progress of the human mind, but rather the modest, fallibilist sense embraced by Gassendy. Now, all of this feeds into Gassendy's conception of the perfect idea. Again, the end and term of the process of reasoning is the rest of the perfect idea. Along the way, the movement consists not only in the progress of the mind, as I've explained, but also in the progress of knowledge. Hence the importance of the arts and sciences, the building in time of what Gassendy calls perfect ideas. For this reason, quote, anatomy, chemistry, and the other arts should be more valued as they distinguish and reveal to us many parts and qualities of things other than those that are ordinarily accessible, and therefore bring it about that we arrive at more perfect ideas. Ultimately, therefore, and this is my conclusion, Gassendy's perfect idea is a progressive notion that governs both his experimental conception of the progress of knowledge and his temporal gradualist interpretation of the movement of reasoning. And with this in mind, it also becomes clear that Gassendy's series of things is no longer the fixed ontological map of the scholastics and is to be understood as a dynamic map in which general ideas depend on the revisable work the mind performs in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And the last presentation in the series is Rudy Guerrero.
Thank you, Dan, and Dana and Claudia for organizing the seminar, and a special thank also to Elodie Cassan for putting together this panel as well as the special issue and etc. etc. Can you see my screen and hear me? Perfect. So the title of my presentation is the same of the title of my paper, which is "Who was the founder of empiricism after all, Gassendi and the logic of Bacon?" Let me just start by explaining the title of this presentation and this paper, and then I will go further down deep in the topic. I refer, in fact, to this quite famous paper that was published in 1981 by Norton, The Myth of British Empiricism, where Norton claimed that basically challenged this historiographical narrative that opposes British rationalism and on the one hand, and continental rationalism on the other. Norton had the idea that basically this Anglo-centric narrative doesn't take into account that the true founder of empiricism is actually a European, like a continental European, Pierre Gassendi. And of course, we know we can discuss very much this claim in its own right. So we know that there's very much material and literature on Gassendy's influence on British empiricism and on empiricism in general, as much as on Bacon's crucial role in the development of empiricism. But at the same time, in the last years, these scholars have tended to try at least to overcome this interpretative divide between these two seemingly contraposed intellectual strands, so British empiricism and continental rationalism, also revising, also showing that these two concepts are not mutually exclusive, or revising the historiographical categories and criticizing that. So what I'm trying to do here is not really trying to, look for a putative founding figure of early modern empiricism. But still, I think that investigating Gassendy's relations to Bacon's logic, as you would say, so empirical logic, is interesting and valid in its own merit. It depends, in fact, on the kind of history we want to tell about empiricism, early modern empiricism at large. So if we want to tell a history that emphasizes building founding figures and system builders, or try to emphasize reception, circulation, and context. Let me just say, before going deeper into this, just a little, I can say, I will show just a little how the debate between scholars stand. It looks like most scholars recognize that Gassendi liked Bacon very much, was very fond of Bacon's version of empirical logic. And in fact, especially they, as Rousseau does, attributes to the influence of Bacon the early interest that Gassendi showed for empirical logic or empiricism. At the same time, there is this kind of interpretative problem that I think was very well highlighted by Olivier Bloch, when he said that actually it looks like it's very hard to point to very specific elements, apart from how Elodie was pointing out at the beginning of this panel, about apart from Gassendy's reconstruction of the history of logic and treatment of Baconian logic in Syntagma Philosophicum. So in 1658, it's very hard to point to very specific elements in Gassendy's own logic that we can attribute somehow to Bacon. This paper actually had three aims. The first was try to take into account the origin and development of Gassendy's logic, empirical logic, and try to understand whether Bacon played any discernible influence at the beginning, at the onset of Gassendy's logic, as Rochot, for instance, claimed. Second is whether there are specific elements of Baconian logic that we can identify in Gassendy's own logic in the Syntagma Philosophicum. And lastly, a more general point, as I was trying to say before, whether we should put emphasis on, we should tell the story of early modern empirical logics as parallel formulations, or we should rather emphasize context and circulations between ideas. So this is very briefly the scheme of what is going to follow. I'm going to speak a little bit echoing Lolordo's claim that Bacon was Gassendy's favorite contemporary. I'm going to try to say, was Bacon really Gassendy's favorite contemporary? And I will try to assess what influence can we trace of Bacon before Syntagma Philosophicum. And then I will focus on Gassendy's own logic. So on the first part of Syntagma Philosophicum on logic, and I will emphasize some elements that I trace as Baconian influences in Gassendy's own logic. And then I will follow with some more general conclusions. Let me just briefly say that I try to condense many things in this presentation, which I, of course, miserably failed to do because the paper was too long and dense. So I will be happy to answer to any perplexity in the question session. So the first part of my presentation is actually quite problematic because it's about speaking of something that didn't actually exist, in the sense that I went through over and over the whole of Gassendy's works, correspondence, letters, exchanges, before basically Syntagma Philosophicum, so before he dies in 1655, so everything that happened before. And I was really looking very hard for references to Bacon, to any kind of reference to Bacon, which I expected to find, because we know that Gassendy's main intellectual reference at the beginning of his career was Peiresc, who was his mentor and also his patron. And Peiresc was very, very, very much interested in Baconianism. He owned a copy of Instructionania and Augmentus Scientiarum, and he also was involved in the diffusion of Bacon in France. And at the same time, Mersenne was, of course, one of Gassendy's contacts. Mersenne was possibly even the translator, someone says, of Bacon in France. Gassendy reads La Vérité du Science, where Mersenne actually speaks about Baconian method. And also this very elusive context of the erudite libertinism, which is a bit of an elusive context, but which Gassendy was part of, was very much fond of Bacon's idea, and yet nowhere it's possible to find references to Bacon in Gassendy's works or exchanges or letters, at least to the extent that I looked very carefully anywhere I could find them, and I couldn't find any. So how do we make of this claim that Rochot and others bring forward, that basically Gassendy's early early empiricism is actually informed and motivated by Baconianism. Well, what I suggest is that we should look at the context of the reception of Baconianism. And for Gassendi, at least in this early part of his career, this context is in fact very much that of the Peiresc circle. And especially if we read the way Gassendi describes and talks about the intellectual figure of Peiresc after his death, when he writes this biography that becomes immediately one of the standard references for intellectual biographies across Europe. Here I'm quoting from the translation, English translation of 1657. No man other than Peiresc made more observations, write Gassendi, or procured more to be made, to the end that at least some notions of natural things more found and pure than the vulgarly received might be collected. For which cause, so as a consequence, he admired the genius and approved the design of the great Chancellor of England, Sir Francis Bacon, etc., etc. So at least in these early years, we can explain the fact, I propose that rather than appealing to a direct influence of Baconianism, we should look at the context in which Gassendi's early empiricism or empirical logic developed, which is that of the Peiresc circle, which is in fact informed to what extent by the reading of Bacon. Actually, what I suggested is this empirical attitude of the Peiresc circle, which included an appreciation for Bacon, but was not necessarily motivated and informed by the reading of Bacon, that with which we might contextualize Gassendi's early experimentalism. And by contrast, account for the absence of Bacon in his works and exchanges. Now I'm gonna just briefly talk about some of my findings when it comes to, in fact, the presence of Baconian element in the Syntagma Philosophicum. I will just emphasize two general lines. As Elodie was emphasizing at the beginning, Gassendi traces this history of logic that starts from basically the Egyptians and the Bibles and ends with Descartes. And here Gassendi expresses appreciation for Bacon's inductive methodology. He uses induction, he rejects syllogism, which is something he doesn't like, and I'm gonna come on it for a second. And also, he quote, the notions of things are held to be poorly and blindly abstracted from the things, from which it follows that the proposition are indeed distorted prejudice, from which it is not possible to elicit anything sound. So this appreciation also for the idea that we have to clear up the mind from the floor, from prejudice. And this is a critic that that is the same critic that actually Gassendi moves to against Descartes. Bacon's logic applies only to physics, which means we would say with a very bad expression that we cannot impose on early modern thinkers, but it's just a scientific method. Doesn't really concern the whole of the activity of the mind. So it's just useful to interpret nature, but excludes all other activities that the mind can perform. And plus, it excludes syllogism, that for Gassendi is, in fact, the form of reasoning per se. So every time we perform a well-formed reasoning, we are thinking syllogistically, according to him. Very briefly, what I actually believe is that the strongest influence that we can detect here, and I remind you, secondary literature have always talked about this influence of Bacon on Gassendi's logic, but never pointed to specific elements. What I believe is actually we can find very specific points of Gassendi's logic in which we can trace clear Baconian, a clear reception of Bacon's logic, as he would say. And I will limit myself here to mention the reception of the idols. As Gassendi writes, although the experience of the senses is the ultimate standard to which one should resort when something is doubtful in a given matter, nonetheless, not every experience should be considered the same, but only to the one that is purged of any urgency or doubt. And later he would use also specifically the word prejudice. So as a clear, I would say, reference to Bacon's terminology. And in particular, there are three of the idols that he really absorbs in his methodology or logic. The canon 12, in the same way, one must be careful that temperatures, state of mind, habit, and preconceived options do not deceive, which whose text, now I don't have time to read it through, but the text actually closely resembles that of the idols of the cave. The canon 13 is actually a lighter version of the idols of the theater. It is also, one also has to be careful that the authority of the narrator does not impose something. And very clearly here also the canon 14 appears to be very close to Bacon's formulation of the idol of the marketplace. One shall guard so that ambiguous words or figurative speech does not deceive. So with the essential difference that for Bacon, actually in the paper I go on confronting, comparing the text of Bacon's aphorism and this specific canon, which are really, really close one to another. The idea here is that, of course, there is a different understanding of words, in the sense that for Bacon, Bacon believes that words per se are deceptive, whereas like Gassendi believes that words can be deceptive if they're used ambiguously and with sophism, etc., etc. Unsurprisingly, here we don't find the idol of the tribe, because in fact Gassendi's logic is based on the assumption that the mind can have an adequate idea through the senses of the external world, at least to a certain extent. And therefore, Bacon's idea that our mind is like a distorting mirror, as he says, wouldn't go along with him. So I have here, we'll briefly discuss this issue. Why Bacon, why there's no Bacon before the Syntagma Philosophicum? Why Gassendi does not quote, does not deal, does not comment on Bacon's logic, on empiricism before he writes his own logic in the Syntagma Philosophicum, so at the very end of this career. Elodie here has a very, very nice paper that was very, very useful for me, where she argues that Bacon is here treated as anti-Cartesian device, in the sense that Gassendi uses Bacon to say, well, there's another way to clear up the floor of the mind from a preconceived idea. We don't need the doubt, the methodical doubt, or we don't need the cogito. We can do that through the reading of Bacon somehow. I have some minor minor pushback to this thesis, in the sense that it looks like so most of the critics that we find here are already present in the Disquisitio Metaphysica. So already in 1644, Gassendi has brought forward all these ideas to counter Descartes back then, without using Bacon, without referring to Baconianism in any extent, in any way. And also, it looks like the history of how the logic in the Syntagma was put together didn't include necessarily Descartes, in the sense that the part, if you go through the manuscript, you see that all the part where Gassendi talks about Descartes is barred, like he wanted it not to appear on the final version of the work, and then somehow changed his mind and says, I believe in this marginalia, this is Gassendi's own calligraphy, il faut mettre tout ceci qui est rayé. We have to include here everything that has been crossed off. So somehow changed his mind. He decided to include this critique of Descartes in the final version of the Logic in the Syntagma, whereas he never thought about taking down the part on Bacon. So never see those parts saw this part as mutually exclusive to a certain extent. So let me, I am within the 20 minutes, great. Let me read my conclusions very quickly. So overall, I believe that my paper shows that there is no trace of a consistent reception of Bacon empiricism by Gassendi before 1650s. And on the contrary, it shows that consistent traces of such a reception are present in Syntagma Philosophicum, and that Gassendi likely incorporated elements of Bacon's theory of idols in his Institutio Logica. This implies that two apparently contradictory statements about the development of early modern philosophical empiricism are true. The first is that the form of early, would say, continental empiricism, such as that developed by Gassendi, can be understood as originating from a specific milieu, such as that of Perez Circle, that looked already enthusiastically towards experimentation. As this empirical attitude developed independently from and parallel to Baconianism, also Gassendi's early empiricism did. Second, at the same time, the influence of Bacon's logic on Gassendi's Institutio shows that any narrative that aims to identify founding figures of early modern empiricism or to circumscribe national or geographical version of empiricism is ultimately untenable. And quote from this very nice paper by Bodeman and Ray, tends to produce a geography or highlight national particularism instead of highlighting the everlasting search for common grounds and the building of shared discursive spaces between the actors. Indeed, scholars have already pointed to Gassendi's influence on major figures of British empiricism, and Locke in particular. In turn, Gassendi was at least in part influenced by Bacon. Both were likely informed by social and intellectual environment that increasingly valued observation and effectiveness over argumentative virtuosity and authority. So this new empiricist logic of idea appears to have been, since from its outset, the product of such a wide circulation and exchange of reflections and concerns on the nature of knowledge, rather than a matter of regional sensitivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Why don't you, can you take down your screen so that we can?
Yes. Perfect.
Great. Now we can see more faces. If you have a question, please either raise your hand or in the chat, just simply write the word question. And I will try to keep track of everybody and try to keep things in order. While you're thinking about questions, there was one that was left by Gideon Manning, who unfortunately had to leave. So I will read that out loud. He has a question about the early modern criticism of logic, or rather the parallel early modern criticism that one can find of philosophy. Can the speakers discuss how criticisms of philosophy, scholastic, institutional, and otherwise, actually drove some in the period to emphasize that they were working in or developing a logic? The one figure I have in mind here is Tschirnhaus, who in the Medicina Mentis specifically notes his unwillingness to use philosophy to describe his work because of the negative associations it has with readers, preferring instead a medicine of the mind or a logic. Incidentally, Tschirnhaus also cites as his sources all of the major early modern figures discussed by the speakers here today. Would any of you like to address that? Elodie?
Sure. Well, I would say that it is the way, well, so the question is how criticisms of philosophy drove some in the period to emphasize that they were working in or developing logic. Well, this is the way they shape this criticism. If you say, if you are in a period of time when philosophy is a system of knowledge, and when you accuse a philosopher of obtaining a wrong conclusion, of being wrong, if you say that someone's conclusions are wrong, if it is an error, then you have to justify this, and you say that this is because they reasoned badly. And so this way of the way this criticism is articulated cannot but connect philosophy as a discourse with logic as a tool for this discourse. Those guys were wrong because they did not know how to reason properly. They did not know how to use their reason. So another theory of the act of reasoning is necessary. Is that what I would say here? Maybe I could add to from a conceptual point of view, the strategy is grounded on the idea that a discourse is philosophical only if it is justified by the search after truth in whatever field. And this is a reactualization of Plato's claim that there is a strong distinction that one should make between a sophist on the one hand and a philosopher on the other hand. And what is very interesting in what Bacon does, for instance, and Descartes and others, is that their operational use of this Plato's claim brings to the fore a major philosophical question, which is the question of language. What is it to speak? Can we access truth, and can we access reality? So that is to maybe answer the logical argument that can explain why criticisms of philosophy drove some people to emphasize that they were working on a logic. This is because they thought that another way of reasoning is necessary, and this is because they thought that one has to elaborate on language in order to know what it is to build a philosophical discourse, and in order to avoid what is reduced as rhetoric. And this is very much what Bacon does in the Novum Organum, and this is very much what he does when, for instance, he criticizes Aristotle. Aristotle's philosophy is an illustration of sophistry, and when wise men talk, they have controversies. This is just idols of the marketplace.
Thank you very much. Would any of the other speakers like to address this? Okay, well,
Maybe.
I'm sorry, yes?
Just to say briefly that perhaps it is wiser not to come up with a grand narrative of the use of the word philosophy, but rather look at local context and at strategic moves responding to local understandings of the term. You could say you're not doing philosophy because that's associated with the schools, you're doing something else. You can say you're doing good philosophy or true philosophy rather than bad philosophy. You could say you're embracing an ideal of philosophy that is pre-scholastic, that it's the right kind of path to truth and self-government. I think there are many strategies that we need to look at.
Great. Donna?
Yes, thank you. This was wonderful. I enjoyed the panel very much. I have a kind of comment / question that might go in the direction of Elodie and perhaps Rudy as well. When it comes to, so sort of for Elodie, but then with a second question for Rudy. When it comes to Bacon's logic, then I think there is quite a difference between his plans to develop a logic outlined in the De Augmentis Scientiarum and in the Distributio Operis, the preface to the Instauratio Magna, and his realization, if the Novum Organum itself is a realization of that logic. And I see basic tensions between the plan and the realization. So when we talk about, when you talk, Elodie, about Bacon's logic, did you talk about the plan or the actual realization? And in the same vein, perhaps for Rudy, if we look for borrowings, now, I would say that there are two kinds of borrowings. There are citable borrowings and non-citable borrowings. The non-citable borrowings are usually experiments or recipes or things connected with experiments and recipes that were seen as being part of a common property of European scholarship, I think, at that time, because they themselves circulated. So Bacon, for example, borrowed them from someone else. So if someone would borrow something that belonged to that category, which is very loosely defined, and I wonder whether that category contains more than experiments and recipes, then that someone would not need to quote. And I think that many borrowings are at that level. And then the question is, of course, which are the quotable borrowings? Whether, for example, the idols are quotable or citable borrowings, or whether the idols are also part of this kind of common thing, and whether methods or elements of the method or methodology are part of the citable or non-citable borrowings. And I think that this is something to reflect on, perhaps, I don't know, and to be discussed case by case. So, Rudy, what do you think about this?
Yes, go first, sorry.
No problem, no problem. Please go ahead, Rudy.
Are you sure? Okay, sorry. In the case of Gassendi, I mean, it's very unusual that he uses some piece of research and doesn't quote it. It's extremely unusual in the sense that is, a very bibliographically accurate philosopher to a certain extent, and also it's also his understanding of history and the very process of formation of ideas that include this idea of quoting, etc., etc. But what you're saying, I'm not sure I get completely what you say, but the thing is, like, I looked very closely also, especially in the early works, the exercitation, etc., whether there were kind of experiments that could be, echoing Bacon, etc., and I couldn't really find anything where I could point my finger at which I could point my finger and say, look, here is Bacon, which is, was extremely.
Sorry, does he quote other people when borrowing experiments from them?
Yes. Yeah, almost, yes, he does very much. So it's surprising. And, there's always, even in that case, so my point is that, of course, is in an environment where Baconianism is discussed and talked upon, etc. So it could also be that he replicates or speaks about people who replicated Bacon's experiments, but it's always like hard to trace the, direct connection between, he's reading Bacon and he's taking up some things and others not. There's a part, for instance, of the exercitations where he talks about heat, and I was like, or also in the Carpenter manuscript when he talks about heat. So it's like, okay, maybe here there's experiments on the form of heat, there is some sort, and then I really compare the lexicon he uses, try to make up, and couldn't really point to anything in particular. But I will look more carefully. Thank you for the suggestion.
Okay, would anybody else like to?
Maybe can I answer Dana's question?
Sure.
Which was the following: when I talk about Bacon's logic, am I referring to the plan or to the realization? Well, I'm talking about both, and I'm focusing. I'm focusing on the realization, that is to say, on the Novum Organum taken as a book. The question is, how are we to understand the claim that there is in the Historia Naturalis et Experimentalis, which is a text from 1623. And there is a passage in this text where Bacon say that the Novum Organum without the natural history would advance the science much less than natural history without the Novum Organum. Well, the question is, what is the status we shall attribute to this text? And my claim is that, to be sure, in the Novum Organum, Bacon is not providing a general theory of experimentation that can merely be applied in the case studies provided by the natural histories he publishes afterwards. But my contention is that the Bacon's attempt at giving experience a formal structure in the Novum Organum are crucial to the building of his natural philosophy. And maybe to be more precise, more precise, we have in the Novum Organum a multi-layer approach to experimental reasoning, and what unifies this multi-layer approach to experimental reasoning is a logical, well, what Bacon builds as a logical principle. And I would put forward this principle the following way: Bacon's conviction of the irreducibility of nature to how it is immediately perceived, and his correlative conviction of the necessity to collect as many data as possible in order to gain a glimpse of the nature's operations. And we see this throughout the text when he says, for instance, that he needs a natural history to be better instructed. When he talks about experiencia literata, which are to put discoveries in writing and to have them flourish. And this is also the case when he promotes Luciferum experimentum. Even this, we also find this idea in the tables of invention, and it is also operative throughout the instances with special powers. So so my point is that, yes, when I talk about Bacon's logic, I talk about the Novum Organum as putting as redesigning, as proposing a redesign of the structure of things, concepts, and words. And I suggest that this redesign governs Bacon's interpretation of experiment in terms of a kind of reasoning. And to this extent, I think that he needs a logic. That's why he does a logic, however complex and however bizarre the whole thing is. If we go across the details, and especially in the second book.
Okay, can we any further answers to Dana's question, or shall we move on? Vincenzo Dorisi.
So thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, everyone, because it was really really interesting. So I have a question on the Cartesian tradition, so perhaps for Roger Arya in particular. it is about the relation between logic and mathematics. I mean, a relation which is very important for us today, but that started in some way in the 17th century, where you have on the one hand some schoolmen, for instance, that attempted to formalize in syllogistic reasoning or non-syllogistic reasoning mathematical theorems. And for instance, Jungius was able to find something which was beyond Aristotle's syllogistic by doing this. And on the other hand, you have some attempts at transforming mathematics into logic, like Hobbes' ideas of computation, or Leibniz logical calculi. So my question is whether the whole Cartesian tradition has some role to play here, given the repeated claims by Descartes that mathematics is the paradigm of correct reasoning, or they go for some other way.
It's a difficult question to answer. So there are parallels between logic and mathematics for Descartes, but I don't think the answer will be satisfactory, because the parallels have to do with syllogism being useless in finding out how discovering things, but only good for displaying what you've discovered after the fact, and which is, of course, what he says about mathematics. When we think of mathematics, and probably when Hobbes is thinking of mathematics, he's thinking of some kind of Euclidean demonstration from principles and stuff like that. And that's not what Descartes is thinking about when he's thinking about what mathematicians are doing. He's thinking that they are, first of all, discovering the thing, and then after the fact, producing this elaborate synthetic presentation of some kind. And so that's the parallel between what he's doing in logic and what he thinks the mathematicians are doing in logic. In logic, you have a method that clears the ground for you to be able to actually reason, to grab an intuition. And you order things, you do these kinds of things in order for you finally to be able to have the intuition and string along a series of intuitions, which he calls deductions. And after the fact, you can do some syllogism, but it's just window dressing. It doesn't do anything. And it's the same thing he thinks of mathematicians. They figure things out, and then after the fact give you these theorems and definitions and stuff like that, which is just window dressing. So he fundamentally he's a critic of every aspect of logic broadly conceived, the whole organon, from the categories to the on interpretation to the prior posterior analytics. And he tells you he is, because he doesn't think logic is useful. He thinks logic just simply either obfuscates or takes you away. That is, logic as formal. So it's the formal that he's against. He's against the formal in mathematics, and he's against the formal in logic. What he wants you to get back to is clear intuitions and get you to a state of mind where you can actually have these intuitions. So he in some ways he's just not going to help. But it's clear what he's doing, which is not what Hobbes would want or what Leibniz would want. But you can see the echoes of all of that in the Poirier logic, and that becomes, and of course that has a place in the history of logic. So that's my answer. It's simply using for logic the same things he says, the tanquam a priori of the second replies, and the tanquam a posteriori of the second replies, and saying that that's really what he's saying about logic and syllogism. They're just after the fact and not before the fact. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. Next question, Hanoch Benyami.
Very much, Dan, and thanks, everybody. Despite my interest in both early modern philosophy and logic, I'd like to raise a skeptical note about their merging here. You described the panel. You wrote, our purpose in this panel is to show that while the role taken by logic towards philosophical modernity is still commonly downplayed, it is crucial to its building. In so doing, we intend to contribute to a broader reassessment of the importance of early modern logic. And Elodie, you quoted from that logician, the one who wrote the history of logic about 50 years ago, who wrote that logic went to sleep in the early modern period, reawakened by Boole and Frege, something you are working against. But I'm not sure you've shown that. I mean, indeed, Bacon, Descartes in the preface to the French edition of the Principles, and the others write about logic. But the question is, do they mean by that what we mean by logic, and used to refer to what the great medieval logicians and Boole, Frege, and those continuing them have done? And I don't think you have shown that about either Bacon or Descartes, perhaps to some extent in Gassendi, because they mean by logic, Bacon and Descartes and most others, what we mean by methodology. And certainly they needed a new methodology. And this replaced the formal logic of the medievals, which was revived indeed by Boole and Frege and others. And this is true both for Bacon and about Descartes. And I think they succeeded. They developed a role for methodology that replaced logic. Since the 17th century, scientists don't study logic. They studied different methodologies, whether in the natural sciences or in the social sciences. Methodologies are, huge elaboration of what we find in the 17th century, but still they go back to that. So I don't think that we find either in Bacon or Descartes any role for what we mean by logic today, which indeed went to sleep by and large in these philosophers, I think.
Okay, who would like to take that challenge?
I don't mind. Can I try?
Sure.
Please.
Well, that's an anachronistic view of what we mean by logic, right? I mean, that's not what the scholastics meant by logic. That's not what the 17th century scholastics meant by logic. So if you mean by logic formal structures, then yeah, they're not terribly interested in that. But that isn't. I mean, so you have the organon. You have the study of of the categories and on interpretation. Syllogism is just one aspect of logic, not the only aspect of logic. Logic is a broader field than the merely formal. In the scholastics, in the ancients of scholastics, and the 17th century philosophers. So Descartes is actually arguing against the posterior analytics, in particular in the reguli. He's arguing against all sorts of things that are called logic and thought of logic for 2,000 years. Yes, it may not be what we, if we think of logic as just the formal, then yeah, they're not. It's not that they've gone to sleep. It's that we're projecting ourselves onto the past. That which I think is a historical mistake. And in any case, there are people today who think of the material conditions for logic and not the merely formal conditions, the merely formal aspects of logic. So that would be my answer. I just don't think that that's the way to write I don't think that this anachronistic view of logic, of course, we can do the development of logic in the way that people do the development of, I mean, you don't need the, the development of logic does the same trick of projecting most people's sense of logic these days onto the past and then saying the rest of this stuff is just junk. That is an incorrect view of doing the history of logic, in my view.
I can respond to this, but perhaps Rudy would like also to add.
I think at this point, our time is up. And my apologies to a number of you who indicated that you had questions that we're unfortunately just not going to have time to get to.
Can I?
Yes, Elodie.
Just maybe a compliment. Bacon says at the very end of the Novum Organum, this was a book of logic. Descartes says you need a logic if you want to do philosophy, and logic is a part of Gassendi's system. That's what we wanted to work on tonight, as logic, either as a part or as a propedeutic for philosophy. I just wanted to add this, and you have my email. You can reach me via mail if you need.
Very good. Thank you all. Next week, we hope that you'll come to a program that is bringing the seminar back to Bucharest in a way, and talking about Van Helmont and Cantemir on time. Thank you very much, and have a lovely week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.